My name is Alex, and this story takes place when I was just 16. Autumn had always held a special place in my heart. I adored watching the last crimson leaves cling to the skeletal branches of trees. The sky was often painted in shades reminiscent of blood, loomed over a perpetually overcast backdrop typical of late autumn. It was a season filled with beauty and melancholia, and for someone like me, restless and incredibly bored in my small-town life, there was nothing better than soaking in the scenery. My friends Jake and Maya, however, had grown weary of my restlessness. They insisted that I needed an adrenaline rush to shake things up. I responded with an exaggerated eye roll, but that did little to sway their determination. "Alex, you know that old Miller's place? The shack that's practically falling apart? It's only a few miles into Blackwood Forest." "Sure, it sounds spooky, but it's not haunted, just old," Jake suggested one day, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Blackwood Forest was more than just old, it was legendary in our town. Whispers clung to it like ancient moss on trees, filled with tales of strange disappearances and unsettling sounds that loomed over anyone brave enough to venture inside. The old Miller's place was a logging cabin abandoned over 50 years ago, rumored to harbor a dark soul trapped within its walls. Normally, I'd scoff at ghost stories, but the thought of being alone in that eerie place, surrounded by the forest's whispers, sparked something deep inside me. It wasn't a dare from Jake or Maya, but rather a challenge I set for myself. Something to fend off the creeping boredom that felt like it was suffocating me. So, on a brisk Tuesday afternoon, as the autumn wind howled through the neighborhood like a wolf's cry, I grabbed a small hiking bag and filled it with essentials: a flashlight, a compass, a bottle of water, and my dad's old hunting knife from the garage. As I stood by the front door, double-checking my gear for this adventure I was about to embark on, I called out, "Dad, I'm just going for a long walk." I slipped on my sturdy hiking shoes, hearing my dad grunt from the living room, clearly engrossed in his football game. He didn't seem worried. After all, I had a knack for enjoying long walks during the autumn season. The crunch of fallen leaves beneath my feet signaled that I had stepped onto the familiar and well-trodden paths of Blackwood Forest, a stretch I often referred to as the initial leg of my journey. As I inhaled deeply, the crisp scent of pine trees mingled with the damp earth, filling my lungs with a refreshing exhilaration that made me grateful to be out in nature. However, as I pushed deeper into the barely visible hiking trails, which were said to lead to the Miller place, the atmosphere began to shift. The woods grew denser, and the sunlight dimmed, with the vibrant oranges of the outer edges giving way to stark browns and grays that felt almost foreboding. Before long, it seemed as though the trees were closing in around me, their branches intertwining overhead to form a skeletal canopy that obscured the sky, making it feel like I was stepping into another realm. In this new world, the air turned colder, and the silence thickened, reminiscent of something out of a horror film. Yet, I refused to let fear make me feel like a timid mouse, so I pressed on, determined to confront whatever lay ahead. By the time I reached the Miller place, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the western sky in shades of bruised purples and fiery reds. The cabin appeared just as people had described it, yet somehow even worse than I had imagined. It wasn't merely old or decayed, it bore the scars of time and neglect. The front porch sagged precariously, overtaken by invasive vines that seemed to be reclaiming the structure for nature. The windows resembled gaping, empty eye sockets, and the roof had collapsed in several areas, exposing dark rafters like broken ribs. Chill ran down my spine, and I sensed that this unease had little to do with the autumn air. Something felt profoundly wrong, but I couldn't back down from the dare that had brought me here. I realized that the hunting knife tucked away in my hiking backpack would likely be useless against whatever I might encounter inside the cabin, yet the whisper of challenge in my mind urged me to move forward. With a deep breath to steady myself, I approached the Miller place and pushed open the flimsy, rotting door. It groaned in protest before crashing to the ground with a startling thud. A thick cloud of ancient dust billowed up, catching the feeble rays of sunlight that managed to penetrate the gloom. The interior revealed a large room strewn with debris. There was a broken table, a rusty chair, and what appeared to be the remnants of a cot, all coated in a fuzzy layer of grime. I called out a hesitant, "Hello." But my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence, sounding thin, almost childish, and completely out of place. There was no reply, just the wind whistling mournfully through the gaps in the walls. I reached into my hiking backpack and pulled out the flashlight, its beam a feeble spear against the encroaching darkness. As I swept it around the room, something caught my eye in the corner. Glinting faintly, I made my way over to a pile of rotting newspapers, using my free hand to shift them aside while the flashlight illuminated my path. That's when I spotted it, an old, tarnished locket, half buried beneath the debris. I picked it up, its weight surprising me. The locket felt cold to the touch, and as I directed the beam of light onto it, I noticed its golden hue. When I pried it open with my free hand, I was met with a faded, blurry photograph of a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7, her hair neatly pulled back with a ribbon. There was something unsettling about her solemn gaze, even in the blurry image, and I felt an inexplicable urge to keep it, quickly shoving the locket into my jacket pocket. Before long, the sunset surrendered to full darkness, and the temperature inside the Miller place dropped significantly. I tried to convince myself that it was just the open roof or the drafty walls, but a prickling sensation crawled across my skin, making me uneasy. Suddenly, I felt the unsettling impression of being watched. Every creak and rustle of the leaves outside sent a jolt through me, making me jump at the thought of something sinister lurking nearby. Realizing it was time to leave, I turned toward the entrance, but then a loud thump echoed from the back of the room, near the crumbling fireplace. My heart raced in my chest as I spun around, flicking my flashlight beam wildly, but all I could see were the dusty shadows dancing under the wavering light. I tried to call out a hesitant, "Hello," but my voice came out as nothing more than a whisper. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the giggle of a child. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the playful sound sent goosebumps racing across my skin. This couldn't be a child or my friends. I was all alone in this desolate area. Panic began to set in. This place was no longer just an old logging cabin. There was something, or someone, here with me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, or a wild animal, or perhaps my imagination was running wild. But then I heard the giggling again, this time much closer. A rhythmic tapping sound echoed from directly above me, seemingly emanating from the collapsed ceiling. My breath hitched in my throat, and in a surge of instinct, I bolted. Bursting out of the Miller place, I plunged into the dense darkness of the Blackwood forest. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the skeletal branches overhead. I swung my flashlight around, but it barely helped. The trees, once majestic, now loomed like grasping claws, their branches reaching out to snag my clothes as I stumbled through. The ground, which had felt like a soft carpet of leaves earlier, transformed into a treacherous, crunching trap. Each footfall echoed loudly in the eerie silence, announcing my presence to whatever was lurking in the shadows. Now, I wasn't just running from an old cabin. I was fleeing from a horrifying sound. The giggling seemed to follow me, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close, weaving through the trees. But it was now mingling with another sound, a heavy dragging noise. It sounded as though something heavy was being pulled across the forest floor. The rustle of leaves around me wasn't not matching my frantic escape, so I stumbled. I went headfirst into a pile of damp leaves, feeling my flashlight slip from my grasp and vanish into the all-consuming darkness around me. My heart raced, a tight knot forming in my chest as I frantically searched for the flashlight. My hands brushed against the cold earth, sharp twigs, and jagged rocks, desperation fueling my movements. Fortunately, the flashlight had rolled beneath a thick bush, and since it was a heavy-duty tactical model, the beam persisted, illuminating a small patch of ground. That's when I noticed it, a single, muddy boot print. It was too small to belong to an adult, and of course, animals didn't wear boots. A chill ran through my veins. Then, I heard it, the dragging sound, now alarmingly close, just beyond the bush, accompanied by those childlike giggles that no longer sounded innocent. They were ragged and strained, almost resembling sobs. I quickly snatched up the flashlight, my hands shaking violently as I pointed the beam forward. My breath caught in my throat when I spotted a figure standing about 20 feet away, partially obscured by the trunks of 2 towering pine trees. It was a girl, small and slender, almost ghostly pale in the flashlight's glow. She wore a tattered old white dress, her head tilted slightly, and though I couldn't make out many features, there was an unsettling stillness about her. A profound sense that something was terribly wrong. She began to raise her head, as if preparing to do something. A scream built in my throat. I didn't want to see what came next. Adrenaline surged through me, pure and potent, propelling me to my feet despite the sharp pain radiating from my twisted ankle I had gotten from my fall. I had no intention of dying in the middle of the forest, so I ran. Ignoring the searing pain, I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, tearing through the skeletal branches that clawed at my clothes and skin. The blackwood forest morphed into a blur of dark shapes and terrifying sounds. I had no idea where I was headed. I just needed to escape. The loud dragging and giggling noises continued to echo behind me, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close, and I felt a cold breath at the nape of my neck as I sprinted. With the flashlight beam aimed ahead, I noticed its light seemed to diminish, struggling to fend off the encroaching horrors that surrounded me. Then, through the trees, I spotted a faint, distant glow. It was the lights of my town. A rush of hope surged through my chest, igniting my weary lungs and aching muscles. I pushed past the last of the skeletal branches and stumbled out of the blackwood forest onto a gravel road that would lead me to the main road of the town. I didn't really pay much attention as I sprinted through the vast expanse of the forest, pushing myself until I finally saw the comforting glow of the streetlights. It was only then that my legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for breath. Nerves coursed through me, making me shake uncontrollably. The air was still crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves, but in town, autumn felt like a warm embrace. The shadows danced around me, yet they were familiar, benign figures cast by lampposts and houses, nothing like the terrifying entities lurking in the depths of Blackwood Forest. The details of my walk back home were a blur, but the overwhelming joy that washed over me as I spotted my house, its warm lights glowing invitingly, is something I'll never forget. As I stepped onto the front porch, I slipped inside, and to my surprise, my dad was still glued to the TV. I locked the door behind me and sank against it, feeling my body tremble. When I looked at my hands, they were marred with bloody scratches, and I noticed the dirt and torn fabric of my clothes. The locket, with the picture of the little girl I had taken from the Miller place, was still tucked away in my jacket pocket. I never really shared the whole story with my dad or my friends. I skated over the details, mumbling about tripping, twisting my ankle, and getting lost, conveniently blaming my compass for my disorientation. They all just shook their heads, probably chalking it up to my usual clumsiness. I told them it was just one of those things I couldn't help, though deep down, I knew I probably could have if my foolish brain had cooperated. But I was acutely aware of what truly transpired. My skepticism had been shattered in the terrifying depths of Blackwood Forest, replaced by a chilling certainty that some things are best left undisturbed. It's been 2 years since my last adventure at the Miller place, yet that locket remains tucked away in a drawer beneath some socks, a haunting reminder of that fateful night in the forest, which revealed its true, chilling nature. I still wander through Blackwood Forest, but I never venture deep enough to catch sight of the Miller place again. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I could swear I hear a faint, childlike giggle lingering at the edge of my hearing, a sound that has become a permanent resident in the back of my mind. I am safe, I tell myself. I made it out. Yet a part of me, the part that clings to that locket, knows I left a piece of myself behind in those dark autumn woods. I'll never truly be the same again. The town of Willow Creek was always beautiful in October. The air turned crisp, the sky became a deep shade of blue, and the cornfields turned a brilliant gold. But for David, a city man who had moved into a lonely farmhouse on the edge of town to seek some peace and quiet, autumn didn't feel peaceful at all. It felt like a trap. His house stood right next to a massive, ancient cornfield that seemed to stretch for miles. The stalks were dry, brittle, and tall, higher than a man's head. During the day, they just looked like a harvest, but at night, when the wind blew through the dry leaves, it sounded exactly like 1,000 people whispering secrets at once. One Tuesday in late October, the sun dipped below the horizon earlier than usual. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple, and a thick, unnatural chill settled over the land. David was sitting on his porch, holding a mug of hot coffee, trying to ignore the strange feeling that he was being watched. He stared out into the darkness where the cornfield began. Then he heard it. David. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft, raspy, and wet voice, as if someone was speaking through layers of dry leaves. David stood up so quickly that his coffee mug rattled on the wooden table. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice sounded thin and weak in the cold air. Silence followed. Then, the sound of stalks breaking, snap, crunch, snap, started coming from deep inside the field. It was slow and deliberate. David walked to the edge of his porch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He clicked on his high-powered flashlight and aimed the beam into the field. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. He moved the light left, then right. Suddenly, the beam hit something. A tall, thin figure was standing between 2 rows of corn. It was wearing a long, tattered brown coat that looked like it had been rotting for decades. Its skin was the color of gray ash, and its limbs were far too long and thin to be human. David froze. He couldn't move his legs. The creature didn't move either, but then its head began to twist. It turned slowly, painfully slowly, until it faced David directly. There was a sickening crack sound, like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. David realized, with absolute terror, that the creature had no eyes, only deep, empty hollows that seemed to suck the light out of his flashlight. David turned and bolted. He ran toward his front door, his feet slipping on the wet grass. Behind him, the sound of the chase began. It wasn't running. It was gliding through the corn, breaking the stalks with a loud, rhythmic crunch, drag, crunch, drag. Every time the creature moved, the wind seemed to stop, and those raspy voices started whispering his name from every direction. He slammed his front door shut, through the deadbolt, and pushed a heavy armchair against the wood. He ran into his living room, shaking, and looked out the window. The yard was empty. But as he stood there, gasping for breath, he noticed something on his front porch. In the soft light of the moon, he saw a pile of black, wet leaves arranged perfectly into the shape of a footprint. A human-like footprint, but nearly 2 feet long. All through that night, David sat in the corner of his bedroom with the lights on, holding a kitchen knife. He didn't sleep. Outside, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just his name anymore. It was a rhythmic chanting, a dry, rustling sound that matched the beating of his own heart. He realized then that the cornfield wasn't just a place where crops grew. It was a hunting ground, and he had been chosen for the harvest. When the sun finally rose, the whispering stopped. David didn't pack his bags. He didn't even grab his keys. He ran out of the house, jumped into his car, and drove away without looking back. He never went back to Willow Creek. But even now, years later, whenever the autumn wind blows and he hears the dry rustle of leaves, he can still hear that raspy, wet voice calling his name from the darkness. In the deep, rural valley of Blackwood, the locals had a strict rule. Once the thick, white autumn fog rolled over the surface of Blackwood Lake in November, you stayed inside. They said that during the fall, the lake became hungry, and the spirits of those who had been lost in the deep water were looking for company. Mark, a young man who had just moved to the area, was a skeptic. He loved camping and didn't believe in local superstitions. On a cold, foggy Friday in November, he decided to ignore the warnings and set up his tent right at the edge of the water. The afternoon was clear, but as soon as the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature plummeted. Then, the fog arrived. It wasn't just a normal mist. It was thick, heavy, and silent. It rolled over the lake like a living thing, swallowing the trees and his campsite until he couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. Mark lit a small campfire, but the flames struggled against the dampness, casting a weak blue light that did nothing to push back the encroaching shadows. Around midnight, a strange silence fell over the forest. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind died down. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic lap, lap, lap of the water against the shore. Then, he heard it, a deep, hollow splash. Mark stood up, peering into the wall of white fog. "Is someone there?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. A moment later, the fog seemed to pull apart. Slowly, a small, wooden boat drifted toward the shore. It was old, covered in moss and black algae. A man was sitting in the boat, rowing with long, slow, and heavy strokes. He wore an old-fashioned tattered gray suit, and his skin was pale, looking like wet parchment paper stretched over bone. Mark felt a wave of freezing air wash over him. "Hey!" he shouted, his curiosity fighting his growing fear. "You shouldn't be out in this fog. It's dangerous." The man stopped rowing. He didn't look at Mark immediately. He sat perfectly still for a long, agonizing minute. Then he slowly turned his head. His eyes were not eyes at all. They were completely black, like deep, murky water with no light in them. He didn't speak. He just pointed a long, bony finger toward the center of the lake. Mark looked where the man pointed. As the fog swirled, he saw them. Dozens of hands were reaching up from the surface of the water. They were pale, wet, and desperate, clawing at the air. The man in the boat stood up, and to Mark's horror, he stepped out of the boat and began to walk across the surface of the water, stepping on those reaching hands as if they were solid stones. Every time the man's foot touched a hand, a low, guttural moan echoed across the lake. The man began to walk toward the shore, moving with a strange, gliding motion that made his feet seem to drift just above the ground. Mark panicked. He scrambled backward, tripping over his tent pegs and falling hard onto the cold, damp earth. He didn't stop to pack his gear. He abandoned everything, his sleeping bag, his expensive camera, his phone, and sprinted toward his truck. He could hear the man's heavy, wet footsteps behind him. Squelch, drag, squelch, drag. He reached his truck, threw himself inside, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, groaned, and finally roared to life. As he spun the tires in the mud and sped away, he glanced one last time in his rear-view mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, surrounded by the swirling white fog. He held a small, rusted silver whistle to his lips and blew into it. The sound wasn't a sharp whistle. It was a long, haunting, mournful cry that sounded exactly like the wind howling across the lake. Mark never returned to Blackwood Lake. He sold his camping gear the next day, and he moved back to the city. But he never felt the same again. Even now, whenever he hears the wind pick up in autumn, or whenever he hears a high-pitched, distant whistling sound, he can't help but remember those black, empty eyes and the feeling of those wet, reaching hands pulling at his sanity.